We're not in any danger of being unambitious. The danger now is suicide.
Roughly 1 in 10 Americans today is depressed.
We are suffering from an epidemic of mental unwellness, largely bred by the expectation that our lives will be stellar, when in fact they are far more likely only to be ordinary. I was a dutiful student when I went to school and then university. I wanted to please my parents and tick all the boxes. But I also knew that if you did that your whole life long, that would be equivalent to being dead.
Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser.
Don't let this year be like last. And if last year was great, still don't let it be that way. Raise the standard. Raise your standards.
So we don't need any more reminders from General Patton or anyone else to get up and go and be a winner. We know that that's in our DNA now as modern human beings. And one of the things we try and do at the School of Life is to say this life is imperfect. Am I the most brilliant person that ever lived? No, but no one needs to be. Most of us are incredibly flawed, we don't really know what's going on, but that's okay. Once in a while we make a good call, we behave with generosity and charity towards others, maybe even to ourselves, and that's enough.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... Alain de Botton is not the man that you would expect he would be. He was born in Switzerland to a wealthy family. He went to schools like Harrow, Cambridge, and Harvard, but then he decided to write a book when he was 23 years old, Essays in Love, and he decided to take his own path. He decided to start to build what he calls the School of Life, his own philosophy that he can teach to other people so they can understand what this world is about. And Alain goes on to say that no one ever taught us about life. They taught us about physics, they taught us about math, they taught us about literature, but no one ever showed you how to deal with relationships, with self-esteem, with confidence, which all the things that we need to be taught how to deal with. And it was great sitting down with Alain. I've been a fan of his work for years. He has physical locations all around the world called the School of Life, where they teach people how to deal with this crazy thing that is life. And in a bit, it's a backlash to what we see happening on social media, where only the strong survive, where everyone is off flying in jets and being beautiful. Alain has tools to help you deal with your life, which might not always look like something incredible that you see on magazines and television. And so I know you're going to enjoy this interview. We talked about so many fascinating aspects, from romanticism to how you raise your kids, to how you deal with even people, colleagues, and friends around you. So sit back and enjoy this incredible experience with Alain de Botton. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Alain de Botton, the philosopher, author, and founder of the School of Life. Your work has been described as a philosophy of everyday life and explores love, status, meritocracy, religion, and self-knowledge. Your school launched in 2008. It now has 13 locations globally and a YouTube channel with over 500 million views. Your books, Essays in Love, Status Anxiety, and The Architecture of Happiness have sold millions of copies. And your latest, An Emotional Education, gives a crash course on emotional maturity. Alain, welcome to London Real.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you here. Really can't wait to get into a bunch of your ideas and IP and all of that stuff. I was wondering if we could start off and just ask you this question. When you were growing up in Switzerland in the 70s, did you ever imagine that you would be doing what you're doing now, running the School of Life, you know, giving lectures all over the world and talking about these concepts? Was that in your brain or not?
Look, I think that the attitudes that I bring to my work now, I like to feel might have been present in the 7, 8-year-old me. As a kid, I loved creativity. That meant at the time the tools I had were Lego, some paints, some exercise books. So I would write, I would draw, I would build worlds. And I loved, the technology we had then. I liked to take things apart, etc. And in many ways, work continues to be an extension of play. And the embarrassing thing is that I enjoy my job so much, it's better than going on holiday. And that's in a way the definition of the kind of work that you want. You want the kind of work that if you didn't have to do it, you'd want to do it anyway. And I was a dutiful student when I went to school and then university. I wanted to please my parents and tick all the boxes. But I also knew that if you did that your whole life long, that would be equivalent to being dead. That, there's a time for submitting to authority and for complying, but there is also a time for strategic rebellion. And I knew that in my bones. I knew that I didn't want to lead a life that was inwardly dead. And because I went to school from a very young age in a pretty tough English boarding school from the age of 8, kind of military establishment, really.
The School of Dragons?
Yeah.
Dragon School.
Dragon School.
I've never heard of this.
I know.
Can you educate us on what this is? The Americans are going to love this because it feels very Harry Potter-ish.
Yeah, well, the British, believe, partly because of their days of empire, that it's useful for a child to be separated from its parents around the age of 6, 7, 8, and to essentially build up a new identity among a group of your peers, play a lot of football, rugby in all weathers, eat thin and undernourishing food, and essentially suffer so that it prepares you to rule over the Congo, parts of Kenya, maybe new universes not yet discovered by Her Majesty's gunboats. Of course, by 1979, this was a hugely outdated ambition, and indeed the whole system is completely crazy. And
was that intentional of that system?
And deserves.
To build up those warriors.
Yes, absolutely. It was absolutely intentional, but completely outdated. So as an adult, I've become, it's interesting. One of the things that I'm fascinated by is attachment theory. And attachment theory as a theory was developed by the English psychologist John Bowlby, who had himself been to boarding school and experienced separation from parental love at a very young age, and realized that it messed him up, and it probably messed up lots of other people as well. And so the whole notion of how much you can trust once your basic trust, the trust that should have been built up in childhood, has been ruptured, is alive at the heart of a lot of our studies of what makes relationships function and what you need to do in order to be somebody who can trust in adult love.
Okay.
So.
And what happened to you, do you think, at the School of Dragons or Dragon School? I mean, were there traumas there? Was there also any upside in that? Did you, I'm guessing you didn't send your children to one?
No, my children have been, held very tightly to my bosom. Okay. And now they are themselves, as should happen, as teenagers, drifting away. But it's that way around. I've kept them as close as they need to be and let the rebellion come from them, as it should be. I mean, let's face it, you don't want your kids spending their whole life at home. At some points, children have to grow disenchanted with their parents. But that should come at its own rhythm in this period of time that we call adolescence, and with a full sense that it's possible to regress. And I think what's interesting about a good adolescence is that it's compatible with regressive episodes, where actually, you dig out the old toys, you re-explore moments of childhood, but then, you face outwards again and have a more adult life. And I think that sets a pattern for what it means to be an adult. I think what it means to be an adult is to be in touch with the child that you once were, that you can be again at selective moments. And, to thread it back to English boarding schools, part of the problem of English boarding schools is that the atmosphere in them, certainly in my day, was a kind of hysteria against the childlike. So, the last thing you wanted to be called was a mummy's boy. The last thing you wanted to do was to be found, clutching your teddy bear, or have any weakness or sentimentality or fragility. These were extremely risky kind of modalities to adopt. And this runs counter to what an emotionally balanced life should be, which, as I say, is a kind of negotiated constant re-encounter with the more childlike aspects of oneself.
Right. How did you deal with the boarding school?
So I coped. I learned how to cope. I was a good boy. I knew how to play the system and play my peers. But boy, oh boy, did I hate it inside. And I knew that this was going to be for a time and for a time only. And even now as an adult, I relish, in a way that perhaps others who haven't been through that system might not relish, my freedom. I love the ability to go where I like, when I like. And part of the reason why, when I finished my education, I didn't adopt a standard career path is I thought this feels too much like school. I didn't want to enter a regimented office culture that might, to me, have kind of re-evoked a very constrained life. So I knew that if I was going to be alive in the true sense, I needed to follow my passions and interests. And when I graduated, those passions or interests were predominantly psychological. What fascinated me was, how do I function emotionally, psychologically, and how do others function? And I wanted to try and put some flags on that territory, map that territory, and read as much as possible, talk to as many people, to give me a sense of, broadly, the meaning of life. I mean, it sounds ridiculous.
It does, kind of.
But, I was a kid who, at university, I would say to my friends, I'm looking for the meaning of life. And they were like, oh, this guy. And
you should go to California for that.
Yeah, but, in Britain, you know that you want to pull that off with a smile.
Right.
And, the worst sin in the UK is to take yourself too seriously, particularly as a so-called intellectual. But deep down, I was a very earnest quester after big answers to big questions. I wanted to know how to love, how to live, how to direct my energies, how society should be organized, what the place of art was, where philosophy should fit in, what an education system should be like, etc., etc. And I've had the great good fortune to build a life where I've systematically been able to explore these questions. But it took, I can't describe to you enough how frightened I was as a 21-year-old. My life was ahead of me. And I knew that I had to perform. I came from a high-performance family. I came from a family where people who were slacking and not doing very much were not tolerated. And I knew that there were pressures on me. But at the same time, I knew that adopting a more standard path in industry or commerce was not going to work for me. But I knew I had to tick some of those boxes. So I had a big challenge. I was under pressure as a 21-year-old. I wrote my first book when I was 22. Published when I was 23, and that, looking back, it was great and I enjoyed it, and it was, I'm happy with that work, but it came from a lot of pressure, and I wouldn't want other people to go through that pressure. I think that was, that was coming from a pretty dark place.
So it was Dragons, Harrow, Cambridge, Harvard, where you were writing that book.
Very briefly.
Briefly for the PhD, and then you wrote the book. 23 years old to write a book that sells millions of copies. There's Hollywood actors that are, in the gutter for success like that early on.
Yeah.
Was that a good or a bad thing? And did it surprise you? And in retrospect, how did that happen?
Look, I think in a way, people who achieve a lot, you always have to ask, why isn't it okay just to be them? Why do they have to put on other things in order to make themselves presentable to the world? And some of it is authentic and coming from a place of health and creativity, and some of it is coming from a place of fear. And I think the two, operated for me. So I think that I needed to perform to impress those around me who, I felt I had to kind of put on a show for. But at the same time, I loved thinking, writing, creating. That's my lifeblood. But I wish I could have been a little more relaxed about the whole thing.
But then it wouldn't have been published.
Maybe not. Maybe not.
Right. And that was a big moment for you.
It was a big moment. So I was 23, and suddenly I was able to make my life, my living as a writer, which I'd never expected. I'd never, I thought it was just like a distant dream. And suddenly I was, getting paychecks for having put words on a page and describe my inner life. So my first book, Essays in Love, called On Love in the US, was, a very personal dissection of a relationship such as I'd experienced it, or partially experienced it, and imagined it as well. And it was a kind of work of psychology, and it rang a bell with people. And that book has, it's published a long time ago now. It came out in 1993, and it's been in print ever since. And it's had a weird afterlife. It's a huge seller and continues to be a huge seller in South Korea. It's one of the books that every young South Korean reads. Now, I totally hadn't expected that. But South Korea, I don't know, for some reason for beautiful reasons, I have a really flourishing career in South Korea.
Why? Mentality similar to yours.
In some way, it must be. I think the South Koreans, in some ways, are searching for the things I'm searching for. Quite early on, I had a very dynamic publisher. I went out to South Korea, went on a kind of speaking tour, etc., and built up a connection with that country. So anyway, funny things happen when you publish, and now we operate in digital channels as well, and you find that certain countries and nations have a feeling for what you do. So Brazil is another country where the stuff that I do has always had a real echo. But then there are countries where it doesn't work at all. And oddly, France is one of them. So my books have never sold copies in France. Everything I do doesn't work in France.
Does that surprise you?
Bless the French.
Because you speak French.
I speak French. I'm very intimate with French culture. I know the French soul very well. So I'm a little surprised.
But the French don't believe in self-help, but you don't do self-help. But you do self-help.
Well, we can talk about that. I mean, okay, my relationship to self-help is interesting. When you say to most people self-help, they imagine something that's American, that might have lurid pink covers, that would be selling you something that is promising a massive change, a transformation, a total reorientation of your life, etc. Do I believe in that kind of self-help? I'm skeptical. I've read all the stuff that everybody's read in this area, and a lot of it is very repetitive, slightly one-dimensional, and doesn't necessarily work. There's some great gems in the traditional literature as well, but that's to summarize. Am I interested in literature that changes lives in some ways, that is alive to our need for understanding and answers and response to our suffering? Absolutely. But I suppose I would do it in a slightly different way. And the books that were self-help for me when I was growing up and developing into an adult were quite different books to the books that most people would treat as self-help. So, the works of Marcel Proust, In Search of Lost Time, that was self-help for me, in the sense that was a book that was teaching me how to love and live. I was reading Tolstoy as self-help. I didn't care about, Russian society in the 19th century. I wanted to know how to live in the late 20th century and how to forge a life for myself. I'm a very, very selfish consumer of culture. I want to know things that will work. I'm the opposite of a disinterested academic who, looks at the pantheon of culture as a kind of, lofty guardian of this for its own sake. I'm for knowledge for my sake and for our own time's sake. And I think if people have responded to my work, it's maybe because they too have an urgent need to find stuff that's going to work for them now. It makes me very unpopular among academics, because academics look at what I'm doing and what the School of Life is doing, and they're like, hang on, we thought it was Plato for Plato's sake, and you're saying it's Plato for our sake? And I'm saying yes, and they're saying no. And it's a philosophical difference, but I'm very willing to stand up and make a case for what I do and the way I do it. You may not agree with everything I say, but I think the essential premise, which is the great books of the past and the great artworks exist now as resources for us to learn how to live and die well, this seems absolutely something we need to hold on to.
And a lot of your critics do come from that academia that says, well, what you're saying is obvious. And that you can feel that because they don't understand your take on it.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting, the notion of the obvious. I'm very much somebody who believes in popularization. Now, what does that mean? We live in mass democratic societies where we are going to sink or swim because the answers that we find appeal not to the tens of thousands, but to the millions. So if you're in the business of ideas, if you're in the business of looking at mentalities and ways of thinking, and there is something about what you do which means it's never going to clear the 1,000-person mark or the 5,000-person mark, I think you need to ask yourself what you're doing and whether you're doing it in the most effective way. Because I think our responsibility as thinking people is to society at large rather than a narrow coterie. So from the first, I was always trying to write works and produce work that would have nothing within it that would mean that an intelligent, completely ordinary, but entirely unschooled person could immediately pick it up and go, yeah, I understand what's going on. There was nothing in it that said, you need a special key, and that special key is bought at Harvard or Yale or Oxford or Cambridge, and that's the only way you can get into this. So I am in this way an intellectual democrat, completely. I believe that the work that I do needs to clear the boundary of ordinary understanding by everybody. And so the fact that my books have sold and my work has gone beyond the boundaries that one might have expected, given the nature of the material I'm talking about, is, I feel lucky, and I'm incredibly glad and incredibly grateful. Am I totally surprised, and is this totally counter to everything I'm doing? No, it is in line with at least a big part of my ambition. If you're talking about love, and you're talking about dying, and you're talking about meaning, and you tailor your message to one or two people, why is that? I was brought up, interestingly, by people who were by different groups of people. Some of my family were very educated and very sophisticated and very complicated, and others had good hearts and clever minds, but had not been through any education. And in a way, some of what I'm trying to do in my work is to build a bridge between these two sides and to make sure that every side is understanding every other. And so every time I write a sentence, I'm rewriting it 3 times. I'm writing it for sense and logic, I'm writing it for intellectual persuasion, and I'm writing it for ease of comprehension. And if it doesn't tick all those boxes, it goes back to the workshop.
And most of your colleagues in those schools you mentioned that you went to are not necessarily writing that way.
No.
And that makes you very different, and then sometimes subject for criticism.
Totally.
You mentioned pressure to deliver a performance to people. I'm guessing you're talking about your family, your mom, your dad, which shapes who you are and shapes a lot of your production. I'm sure everyone's tried to analyze you and your parents, but can you speak on that briefly? Because you watched, we're influenced by our parents. I know I am, and I know what you mean. Part of what I do is because it comes from me and I love it, and part of what I do, I'm sure I'm still trying to get the approval and attention of my parents who divorced when I was 7, and that's just something I'm going to live with.
Look, I think it's one of those things, you don't need to be a fully paid up Freudian or psychoanalyst or defender of psychotherapy to accept a basic fact. The way that we are as adults sits on an emotional base that was formed in childhood. And a lot of the behaviors that we manifest as adults can be traced back, sometimes arduously and nebulously, but clearly back to things that happened to us as children. And this is very boring. It's like, hang on a minute, I'm 50 years old and you're telling me that, what I'm doing now, today, dates back to something that went on with my father or mother. This is an insult. It could seem like a humiliation. It isn't really. And I think the best thing we can do is to own up to it, to recognize it, share it with others. We're all the products of our childhoods, and our adult identities, sitting on a very thin crust of adulthood, and then comes the childhood. So my own life, sure, I experienced parents who didn't from the first think I was terrific. They had problems, and that's made me a little harder than most on myself, and it's meant that my own decency as a human being is not immediately apparent to me. I feel that there are things I need to prove to those who might want to love me or like me, to those around me. Historically, I haven't liked myself very much. It's been a really big journey to say, I might be okay. I might not be brilliant, but I might be good enough. At the School of Life, we're very keen on this wonderful British psychoanalyst who was writing in the 60s, broadcasting a lot as well. This man, Donald Winnicott, was a pioneer of child psychoanalysis. And he came up with a wonderful phrase. He said that, no parent, and indeed no child and no adult, needs to be perfect. The only thing we all need to be is good enough. And this notion of being good enough, depending on where you're coming from in life, could sound either like the most obvious thing, like, of course I know how to be good enough, and that's fine. Or it could sound almost miraculous. Really? I have permission to be good enough? And for those of our viewers for whom they'll go, wow, can I really be good enough? Is that enough? Is that okay? If you come from a certain sort of background, that's going to be a surprise to you, and probably a journey of real self-acceptance. But a wonderful thing to be able to get to a stage of thinking, yeah, am I the most brilliant person that ever lived? No, but no one needs to be. And indeed, it's a kind of psychotic feeling, that structure, to imagine that the only way in which you can live is at the pinnacle of human achievement. I mean, let's get statistics right here. You know, we're living on a planet of 7 billion people. Most of us are incredibly flawed. We don't really know what's going on. We're, you know, maneuvering in the darkness, but that's okay. Once in a while, we make a good call. We behave with generosity and charity towards others, maybe even to ourselves, and that's enough.
Your dad was a workaholic, managed a lot of money in Switzerland, taught you maybe you didn't want to do that stuff. Maybe you saw that, as in maybe that wasn't the end-all goal for you. And mom, nurturing?
I've been banned from talking about my specific parents. I've caused so many upsets, so without wishing to be cagey, they did a brilliant job given who they were and what they lived through. And they did the best they could. I think, you know, past around, I think the cutoff date is probably around 43. You need to stop griping about your parents and simply have a blanket thing of like, they did what they could. And I think that's not to whitewash the question. It's actually a very deep point. Literally, as parents, most parents do what they can. And you always need to look at their parents and where they've come from. And, you know, I'm in the business at this stage of, you know, charity and love to all who try. And so, yeah, we'll leave it
once you become a parent, you realize how hard it is and how you've got your own life going on and you're just doing the best you can, and it's always going to be flawed.
Sure.
And you're going to pass on things whether you like it or not. And then also, once you see that journey, you can, even in perspective, look back and say, wow, if my father wasn't this way, there might not be a school of life. And, you know, and so
sure,
in a weird way, it created the beautiful things about you as well.
That's right. We're all billiard balls that are kind of hit in random directions by the accidents and forces of life around us, and we end up in sometimes good, sometimes, you know, bad places. But you know, I'm grateful to many things in my past and to the age in which I live. You know, before we were recording, we were talking about, you know, how fortunate it is that we now live in an age where people like you and I can record stuff without asking the powers that be, the big powers that be, whether we've got permission to do it. We can make our stuff, we can get books out, we can get material out that, you know, for hundreds of years we wouldn't have been able to do that. So we've been blessed by many things. And so even if sometimes historical forces take us in directions we're less happy with, let's be grateful that, you know, we can have this conversation and benefit from the technologies that underlie it.
Yeah, and what I've found with broadcasting all these conversations over the last 8 years is that maybe like you are taking Plato and showing the masses, or even yourself and learning something from that, or Tolstoy, is that I find that a lot of our viewers will listen to someone's story and take one little bit out. Remember my dad told me, he said, Brian, 1,000 people can watch that show and everyone's going to take something different, one from minute 42, one from minute 53, based on wherever they're at in their life at that random moment. And they'd be like, wow, that just helped me get over that thing. And he said, you're never going to know what it is. All I can do is try to set up a story that's didactic, that shows vulnerability, that shows a character arc, that shows failure, that shows some type of learning, and then see what happens. And everybody needs to learn from the person that they need to learn from. So funny enough, you know, a bodybuilder might give someone a lesson that an academic can't.
And also, you know, what's fascinating is it's about the time in your life that a lesson hits you. So you have this, you know, a good book is only ever a book that you're reading at the right moment. And the right moment is going to be a bizarre confluence of needs and also a readiness to grow in a certain direction. I mean, there are moments in our life where somebody will tell you something and you're, in inverted commas, not ready to hear it. In other words, the idea, though correct, may be so threatening and so potentially destructive to the way in which you've ordered your life at that time that you are not ready to take it on board, even though maybe 10 years later you've grown more solid in areas and you can take it on board. A lot of good ideas are both good but also anxiety provoking. In other words, if we were really to listen to them and take them in deep, we'd have to change things about our lives. Maybe we'd need to get out of a relationship or into a relationship, change jobs, change our likes and dislikes. And sometimes we're not ready to make those intellectual kind of transitions. And so we need to block our ears. You know, and I'm sympathetic to that. We're all sometimes, maybe at all times, in denial about certain ideas that we are not strong enough for, even if those ideas are very good. And so, you know, I see it I see it in people around me, people I love, who I'll be telling them something 1 year, and they're like, wow, what is this? And then 3 years later, they'll come back and go, you know what? Can we go back to that? And I do the same, So it's all about, maturation is, becoming a mature adult is an intermittent, peculiar process, and a lot of it is getting to a place where the difficult truths can land in safety. And we, in our culture, we speak so highly of thinking. We're always saying, like, thinking is good, reading is good, taking on ideas is good. Yes, but sometimes we're not ready for it because we're scared. Intellectual laziness is fear. There's no such thing as laziness, it's just fear. You're afraid that some things you might hit upon might open doors through which you are not keen to walk at that time. And so when people, sometimes they're in a mood when all they can do is check Twitter and look out of the window and not focus in on themselves in any way, and they need to be distracted, it's frequently because there's an insight that they are resisting. And I think we can be generous towards that need to resist it. Like, maybe that insight is too big. They can't think about it. But we need to create, I think, in our lives, areas of safety where we can look at dangerous material. I'm very keen on psychotherapy. I think psychotherapy, done well, it's often done quite badly, but done well with the right sort of person, can be a wonderful, safe place in which to let dangerous ideas out and kind of entertain thoughts that maybe just felt really risky the rest of the time, and we can just give ourselves that time. But people can do it at other moments. You can have a long hot bath without technology, and you're just left with your thoughts. And during that time, the important thoughts can bubble up. And the middle of the night is good. I mean, often what we call insomnia is really a kind of the mind's revenge for all the thoughts that you, in inverted commas, forgot to have during the day, but that need to emerge. And if you don't let them emerge, a little part of you is going to wake you up, and it's 3 a.m, it's very inconvenient, and you've got lots to do the next day. But even more important is that you be able to think about certain things.
What are the modalities do you think are good? And when you say psychotherapy, you mean in the classic sense? I sit down, I talk about my problems?
Sure.
Okay.
I sit down with another human, I plug my brain into another brain, and I basically take the spirit level. I check out whether the way I look at things is really fair and good and the right way of looking at things. And I think very often when people go into psychotherapy, they start questioning stuff because, people will say, I'm in a relationship and, I don't know, we never hug. And that's normal. And maybe a psychotherapist goes, do you like that? Is that a good thing? And the person goes, no, I hate that. And they go, well, is that normal? Sure, it's been normal for 20 years. And the person goes, well, but do you want it to be normal? And suddenly you start to ask a question, And so patterns of being unhappy that we've locked ourselves into get questioned. And psychotherapy done well should be a journey of liberation. We should have a lot more options. One way of looking at unhappiness is people who are in one way or another in a tunnel. They say, the only way to live is this way. They're not happy with it, but it seems the only way. I've got to love this person, though it's not making me happy. I've got to do this job, though it's a prison. I've got to live in this place, though I don't like it. And, we can unpick some of those things and say, really, is that absolutely necessary? Where human beings are brilliant at building themselves cages and throwing away the key. Those cages, this is the great insight of existentialism. Existentialism, in its essence, is an attempt to say human beings are born free and manage to enslave themselves. And that process of enslavement is what existentialists study. All the different ways in which we say that X or Y is necessary when in fact it isn't. And
some say there's no key. We're just in the cage, the door's open, and we just sit there.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, largely because, think of our upbringing. We grow up very slowly. We're not really adults till we're 20 or more. And we grow up, all of us, in some very constrained environments. We are taught to be good boys and girls. We are taught that, there are procedures to jump through. It takes a long while and a lot of courage to imagine that doing the slightly unexpected thing might be viable for you. To be a mature human being requires such a fine balance between compliance and liberation. too much liberation, and you end up, the kid who leaves school at 16 without the right skills, without the right experience, without the right basis, who has to rebel all the time against everybody and who can't achieve because they're in a permanent fight against authority. On the other hand, to swallow everything that authority tells you, that's not going to be a recipe for disaster as well. If you do everything that the powers that be expect you to be and do, you will end up in trouble, oddly. A particular kind of trouble. The trouble that ends up when you're inwardly dead, even though outwardly, in inverted commas, successful.
This is the super pleaser.
The super pleaser.
Okay.
We hear so much about rebels. We don't hear enough about the people pleasers, who are, in a way, in a far more dangerous spot. They're also far more numerous. People who haven't found a sensible way to say a gentle no to certain of the things that society and life proposes to us that will actually kill us, slowly but definitely, if we accept it.
Other modalities to examine your own psyche, do you think about things like meditation, breath work, cold therapy, exercise, psychedelics? Because all of these can give you a different view on your brain, usually without another human involved. How do you feel about those? Because I've had experience with all of those in the last 3 years, and I've gotten a lot of insight from them. Sometimes it takes me years to process that insight.
Look, I think that we can say that lots and lots of things enable us to gain insight into ourselves, superior to that which we would gain if we simply went about our ordinary life. Some of those things are called art. Reading a certain kind of book opens your mind in ways that you would just never have known. A certain kind of book that will blow your mind. And I'm using the word often used around drugs for good measure, because literally the experiences that people on psychedelics might report around, a magic mushroom could be available around the paintings of Rubens or Titian or Picasso or others.
It could be.
It could be. So I think that the word drugs deserves to be expanded to encompass magic mushrooms for sure, a certain kind of breath work for sure, that is also a drug. But it could also include a certain kind of Swiss Alpine cheese or pomegranate juice or the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich. All of these things function as tools to open up areas of perception and self-awareness that might not be available in so-called normal life.
And you're for all of that, or you're for anything that gives you that new perspective.
Yes, and I'm for imaginative relationships to it. So, I remember as a student reading about the Dionysic festivals of ancient Athens. The notion that the ancient Athenians, around the beginning of March, would regularly open the doors of the city, get extremely drunk, and go dancing, and enter a kind of ecstatic state of dance in honor of Dionysus, the god of wine, drinking, debauchery, chaos, but also of sanity understood in its broadest sense. We need to go a little crazy in order to remain sane. In the medieval times, there was the famous Feast of Fools, where for one day of the year, society would be turned upside down, and the fool would become the wise person, and the wise person would become the fool. That is the correct order. The kind of reversal of order is in itself a correct order. And I think that in a modern society, unfortunately, too often, people who want to open our minds to different ways of thinking and feeling have been put in a box called spirituality, called hippies, called drug takers, and those labels have alienated the rest of respectable society from taking a look. Because people go like, I'm not a druggie, or I'm not a hippie, or I don't do that weird Eastern stuff, right? And I understand that those kind of labels and that sometimes the fear and apprehension that lies behind it. And sometimes the advocates of these slightly different ways of thinking about life don't make friends for themselves. They don't make it easy for the rest of us, because they present their wares in ways that are designed to really frighten and alienate, a busy doctor or a sensible geography teacher facing middle age, or many of the kind of people who belong to ordinary society are unjustifiably put off by these different ways of thinking and feeling. So look, there's no doubt that what you eat, what you drink, how you stand, how you sit, how you breathe, the chemical constituents of your blood. All these things have a real impact on how you think, how you love, how you view your life, etc. And by making certain adjustments, you can definitely have a mentality that is more suited to where you want to go in life. And so, by all means, we should, all of us, keep an open mind about many of these things. For many of us, paying greater attention to our posture might be very good. Paying greater attention to the rhythm and the rate at which we're breathing might be very worthwhile. For some of us, maybe the magic mushroom road might be the road to go. For some of us, it'll be psychotherapy. All these things belong to a more generous sense of how our minds work. Our minds are not merely cool, calm, rational organs that are operating on data from right now. These are ancestral machines that are bathing in their own history, that are driven by fears and appetites formed in a past we can hardly remember, we could hardly put words to. We are driven by chemicals, by the air we're taking in. And all of this is part of what it means to be a thinking, sentient being. So if you're in the thinking space, sure, take an interest in it. And I definitely do.
And a lot of your work questions the assumptions that we have about ourselves, like what you just put in now, that we're these really weird, unstable, flawed beings. So let's just admit that, and then we can move forward. I mean, a lot of...
Yes, I mean, look, I think that one of the ideas that I've always been really interested in is the concept of imperfection. And, in the modern world, largely because of science, we have an ideal of how we can perfect our lives. Out in Silicon Valley, these guys who are pioneering, what the late 21st century is going to look like, are looking to eradicate death. That's the ultimate goal. If you're a young tech person, your ultimate dream is not to have to die. And of course, none of us want to die. But imperfection stalks us. I don't think we will ever overcome it. And indeed, the quest to be immortal, to be free of blemishes, to be always correct, to say and feel always the appropriate thing, is in itself a form of madness and wrongness. And I think that we best accommodate ourselves to the conditions of life by accepting in an a priori way that we are flawed, those around us will be flawed, we will make errors, those around us will make errors. We are largely in the dark, therefore we need to go easy on ourselves and be generous towards others. We need to adopt, if I can put it this way, a tragic perspective on life. Greek tragedy was born from the insight that only the gods know, that we humans are blind creatures. We stumble into error, and we must be kind to ourselves and others because we're constituted out of base and imperfect matter. In Christianity, we find the idea that we are originally sinful. The concept of original sin. We are the heirs of Adam and Eve who ate from the tree of knowledge and who were not perfect beings, and therefore none of us can be. Now, I'm an atheist, I'm a committed secular person, but I love this kind of mythology around imperfection that begins in the Garden of Eden. If you look at Buddhism too goes from the idea that life is suffering. That's the first rule of the Buddha. Life is suffering. In other words, we creatures are primarily well set up to find the glass half empty rather than half full. We register pain more than beauty, suffering more than joy. And once we know this about ourselves, we become more bearable and life becomes more livable. I think one of the questions that we should all of us know how to answer of friends, family, a date that we're on is, how are you crazy? It's not an insult to be asked, how are you crazy? How am I crazy? All of us are crazy. The question is just how. What particular bit of craziness have you inherited? All of us have inherited different bits of crazy, but you know for sure, without needing to talk to anyone, that they are going to have supped from the cup of human craziness. And that isn't a pointed insult, it's actually the most generous thing you can say about us humans. And if I can say one thing against America, why am I talking like this to a nice American like you? I don't know. But the United States was founded on a kind of millenarian utopianism by people who came across from England with a vision of building the New Jerusalem. And the idea that Jerusalem could be built on this land at this point, not in the next world. Now, for me, the genius of Christianity was always that these guys located paradise not on this earth, but somewhere else. Because if we have to expect that we're going to build paradise on this earth, my goodness, we're going to be fed up when the train runs late, when our politicians don't say what we want, when our lovers aren't as perfect as we wanted them to be. We'll be in a rage because we thought there was going to be paradise. We thought that happiness was a right rather than an occasional amazing thing that might visit us in an otherwise dark and tempestuous life. So I think that it all depends on your starting point. And one of the things we try and do at the School of Life, we are a self-help institution, but my goodness, one of the first things we try and do is to say this life is imperfect. And if you're suffering and flawed, it's not that your life has gone wrong, it's that you are human. And that's the basis upon which we start all our work. But rather than this being a come down or a humiliation, most people are really happy to embrace it. They're like, oh right, okay, so my sense of myself as strange and oddly flawed and always making mistakes, this is not some individual curse, this belongs to the human race at large, even though the adverts are not going to tell us that. And once we can provide that kind of public reassurance, it's very moving. One of the things we do at the School of Life is we have conferences a couple of times a year, and we gather 500, 1,000 people in a large hall. And one of the first things we do is to say to people, that all of us are trying to be impressive. The first thing we do when we meet somebody new is try and impress them. And we try and impress them through our status and our power and our flawlessness. But actually, what wins us friends, what truly breaks down barriers between people, what wins us enduring loyalty and love and ultimately safety is the revelation of vulnerability. You cannot be friends with somebody if all you're trying to do is tell them how great your life is. The beginning of friendship is the acknowledgement of pain. It's on that basis that you break down barriers and turn a stranger into a friend. So we tell our people who gather, we say the doors are shut, no one's on Twitter, this is between us. But could you turn to a stranger on left or right and tell that stranger something you're ashamed of, something you regret, and something you fear? And at first, there's a deep intake of breath. Everybody's like, really? Do we have to do this? I thought we were just going to shoot the breeze, right?
Right. But
actually,
then they embrace it, don't they?
They embrace it. And people love it because it's an opening to a channel of pain that the conditions of ordinary life mean that we normally cannot reveal, but are longing to reveal. And one of the things that we pick up, and I pick up so much in my work, is the depth of shame and isolation and loneliness under which people labor. We think we're in a social world, we think we're in a connected world, but my goodness, we're not. We're still taking the first stumbling steps towards acknowledging what it's like to be a human being, and to own up to really how we feel. Let's talk about sex. One of the things we try and do at the School of Life is to get people talking about sex in the right way. We think we're a sexually liberated world. My goodness, we're not. People are so ashamed and embarrassed of what they want, what they don't want, what they've tried, what they haven't tried, who they are. There is still such a fear. The human who has been able to be honest about who they are sexually is still waiting to be born.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.